My name is Ricardo Flores. I'm with a group called the Local Initiative Support Corporation. So we are one of the best kept secrets in the United States, which is not a good thing to be a secret. But we stand for the Local Initiative Support Corporation. We were started in the late 70s. We were a spinoff of the Ford Foundation, and essentially we are what's called a community, or not essentially, but we are what's called a community development financial institution. More common CDFIs to the public are credit unions. All credit unions are CDFIs. So we are what's called a non-depository CDFI. And what we do is essentially we provide loans to developers, for-profit and non-profit developers, to build affordable housing. And we play the most crucial part in that process, actually. When developers or for-profit or non-profit are looking for land, they have to either go to a bank, and most banks will not provide them that capital because they don't actually own the affordable housing building. The public actually does. And so they'll come to a group like LISC, and we will provide that. Why we do what we do? We do what we do because for us, it's about helping our communities out, helping inner city communities. If we all remember our history, the federal government essentially told banks not to lend in certain neighborhoods, and because of that lack of lending in those neighborhoods, to this day, those same communities are struggling with a lack of investment. And so what LISC tries to do is essentially we try to bridge that gap. And our capital, the money that we lend out in the millions of dollars, and you can click the...
Okay, keep going.
Sorry. The money that we lend out it actually comes from banks. And the reason why is because, and that's just our profile, we have 30 offices around the country. You can change it. Our money comes from banks because banks have very strong obligations under the federal government, under the Community Reinvestment Act, to make investments in inner city communities. And so last year alone, banks like Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, and others put $380 million of money into LISC, and that's the amount of loans that we did last year. So we are a substantial provider of funding for affordable housing. And because we're able to do affordable housing, we can also invest in businesses as well. The secret to our sauce in some ways is not only the money from the banks, but also that each office, each 31 office, and I'm the head of the San Diego office, we have underwriters. So I have a colleague of mine who's an underwriter who can make evaluations about proposals to decide if we're going to fund them or not. And so that's really the goal of LISC. LISC's goal is to take the capital that's in Wall Street and up here, and it's to get it to our inner city communities down here. That's the goal of LISC, and we do that in many different ways. Why I'm here talking to you folks and why there's opportunity, I feel, is because our health industry is looking to cut costs. The challenge is that once you leave the doctor's office, you can't control the costs. And that means if they go home to a home, or if they go home to a home that's unstable, those are all problems that may lead them back to a hospital or to some sort of clinical office. And so we at LISC, in the past several years, we are now looking at what you all know as the social determinants of health, because we are realizing that our hospital partners and providers out there have an interest in cutting down costs, and they're getting more and more interested in the communities that LISC has been working with in the last 40 years. Why they're interested? Because they're interested in how the people are living there so that they could cut down those costs. And so that's why LISC is such an interesting organization, because ultimately we have access to capital to do this work, and we've been doing it. But now we're seeing that there's additional partners in this room, partners around California in the healthcare industry that could work with us as well. And so this is something very new for us. LISC National has actually done a couple deals. One was with ProMedica Healthcare back east, where we are working with them. Part of it we're doing with them is also not loans, but affordable housing, but also we have financial literacy programs and things like that. And so I think there's an interesting synergy when we talk about community development that healthcare plays a huge and crucial role to it. In fact, Steve provided me an article from the Federal Reserve that talked about mental health and community development. And again, it goes without saying, if you live in a community where there's high crime, low opportunity, there's more stress indicators in those neighborhoods, there's more challenges that people are facing in those neighborhoods, it goes without saying that folks are having challenges, and You are seeing that when they go in to talk to healthcare providers. And so the goal is, how can we stabilize these communities? How can we get capital to these communities? But most importantly, how can we get capital to these communities, but also allow for the community to have a say in where the capital goes? Because that's really important, right? So we've had communities for years that have been disinvested. And now all of a sudden people say, well, we have money to go in your community. Well, the community is a little frightened by that, frankly. So they want to make sure that those investments go to what they're interested in, and that's what LIST does. That's our whole goal, is to partner with these local community groups and to try and help them and developers build affordable housing in their neighborhoods.
How can they get involved?
Oh, well, getting involved by our contact information is up here. And here's an example right here on the lending. So you can see here, these are projects we lent. And so the top one is, we lent $7 million there to buy that building. The one below, we lent about $3 million to buy that piece of land. So we're a substantial lender. We're a substantial lender in what we do. And really, the way we want to get involved with you folks is by doing what I'm doing now, but also we're actually talking to large hospital organizations in California to really to look at where they're putting their money, because we also know too, the other side of this is that under Obamacare, we know that hospitals have a greater incentive now to be out in the community, to be making sure that those communities are functioning. And what we're interested in is trying to work with hospital providers and others to make sure that their investments are secure, to make sure their investments are going a long distance, and more than anything is to leverage the investments. And I think that's what Steve was talking about is, so we're not traditionally going after certain federal monies. Our traditional monies are, in this case, banks. But we know that there's other organizations like hospitals and others who have strong incentives to do good. And so that's our interest, is to see, can we partner with those organizations, leverage the resources and the tools that we have, make improvements in those communities, and hopefully all of this leads to better outcomes and lower costs for our hospital partners.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, my name is Jake Segal. I'm a vice president at a nonprofit called Social Finance. I'm here to talk to you about a bit of a funky, different idea. I promised Steve that I would be pithy and controversial, and I'll do my best to hold true to both of those things. Let me start by picking up an idea that Alex dangled in front of us earlier today. Most governments in this country buy services. Right, and by my kind of back of the envelope math, we're talking about in the social sector, things like health, behavioral health, education, corrections, talking about $2.5-ish trillion a year worth of services. And my first controversial idea is that the vast majority of things that we buy aren't delivering on what we anticipate. They don't work. They work in some ways, but they're not actually achieving our primary objectives. And I come to that conclusion by looking at, the corpus of randomized control trials in this country. If you think about the 15 years worth of RCTs being run by the Institute for Educational Services, 90% of them don't deliver on their primary outcomes. Or, in the 25 years of Department of Labor RCTs, 75% of them have not shown any impact on their primary outcomes. And this holds true across almost every realm of the social sector, even parts of the hard sciences. So the fact of the matter is, we're spending lots and lots of money on services. And a lot of the time, those services aren't delivering. It's not that people aren't doing them well, and it's not that there aren't needs. It's that we're not actually getting the outcomes that we care about. Okay, so why is that? There are lots of reasons why. One is that it's really hard to change outcomes for people who are incredibly vulnerable. It's just hard to change outcomes, period. Right? And the fact is that context matters a lot, right? You can go out and try to find your best evidence-based practice, but the fact is that a lot of that evidence is a lot sketchier than you might hope when you really dig into it. And that evidence isn't the only thing. The recipe isn't all that matters. It's also the chef, and it's also someone tasting the soup a lot and making, adding a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper, whatnot. So context matters, and we've built a culture in which we are reliant on compliance. Right? One of the co-founders of the organization that I work at likes to point to the venture capital industry, and now that I live in San Francisco, I feel like I can take that on. He says, if you're a startup founder and you go and you get seed money and you lay out a business plan, and then you come back a year later and you said, I executed everything on my business plan, your VC funder is going to say, what the hell are you doing? adapt a little bit, learn from the market and do something different. But the fact is we built up systems of compliance such that we lay out a plan and we execute on that plan and we don't necessarily change, even though context is hugely different in different places. Flexibility and adaptiveness aren't built into these systems. Okay, that was my controversial idea that I wanted to seed. Now I'll actually tell you what the heck I do. We build outcomes-based contracts. So I work at a group called Social Finance, and do you have the slides? You can just go to the second one. You don't need to, it's fine. What we do is we work with mostly governments and health systems to build performance-based contracts around human outcomes. So the idea is, instead of buying services, what if we were to buy outcomes? It's an interesting idea, but it's also a tricky one. Right? There's layers of challenge and complexity that underlie that. Let me walk you through the basic mechanics and an example, and then I can talk you through some of the complexity.
What's up now?
You can go to the second one. It's a triangle. Spoiler alert. The way the triangle works is this. We start with the bottom right-hand side. So we work with what we call outcomes payers, who are typically some flavor of government. Call it, and the example I'll give, the Ventura County Executive Office, for example. And we try to identify outcomes that they care a lot about and that are pretty high on their priority list. And if we can, identify those critical outcomes, how we would measure success on those outcomes over a set period of time, both in terms of what success looks like and how we would do the evaluation, and then how valuable that is to a jurisdiction, then we'll go out and try to find the top part of the triangle, which is, are there interventions out there today that are being undervalued? And when I say undervalued, I mean things that actually have relatively good evidence that they might be effective, but aren't being bought up at the right level of scale. And I can talk more if people are interested later on about how we try to make that evaluation. So if we can make a match between outcomes that an outcomes payer really cares about and an intervention we think isn't being bought up at the right level of scale, we'll build a performance-based contract there in which the outcomes payer says, we will pay a certain amount if an outcome is achieved against whatever our counterfactual is. But the fact is that most nonprofits can't afford to front the money to do this intervention for a year or 2 years or 3 years until we deliver on the outcomes. And most of them can't afford to take on the risk of an outcome not being achieved. So because of that, we actually offload the risk onto a third party, and that's the bottom leg of the triangle here. We'll go out and raise capital from the impact investing market, and that's folks like CDFIs, but also foundations using their impact investing money, or high net worth individuals, or some combination of all of those. And they will actually take on the risk. They'll provide the upfront working capital to help scale up a high quality intervention. That nonprofit, or CBO, will actually deliver on the intervention itself. And then to the extent that it is successful at achieving outcomes, the outcomes payer, so some form of government, will agree to repay those investors. With the potential for, if it doesn't work out, they might lose all of their money. And if it goes really well, they might make a small return. So that's the short idea. Let me pause there. Nodding heads, sleeping heads, a little bit of both. Good, okay. We'll talk for just a minute about, can we go back up to the slide right above, about the principles underlying this whole thing? So this idea is called, in this country, is called pay for success. Or you might have heard of it referred to as a social impact bond. My organization, Social Finance, did the world's first one of these things in 2010, so it's been a whopping 8 years. It's a pretty small field at this point. We did the first one in the Peterborough prison system in the UK. We were founded here in the US in 2011 and have brought this to 22 jurisdictions around the country. So it's still a relatively new and relatively small idea. But it's premised on some things that are not new and not small. So I think the pay for success is fundamentally about these 4 principles that are up on this slide in pretty colors. It's fundamentally about focusing on outcomes that really matter to policymakers. Right? So when we're talking about outcomes and outcomes-based contracts, we're not talking about the small things, right? The small but hard things of getting people enrolled and making sure they're getting a certain quantum of services. We're talking about the outcomes that policymakers are writing budgets and making policy about. It's focused on, oh, wow. Hey, look at that. It's focused for the second part on tying payment and performance together. My last job was with a group called the Bridgespan Group, which is a nonprofit consultancy, and I worked with a lot of nonprofit leaders. And they would often tell me that they had 2 really different jobs. Right? One was go out and deliver on the thing they say they were going to do, and the other one is to go out and raise money for it. And oftentimes those things don't overlap. And a lot of my, agency clients, my government clients feel the same way, that payment and performance are not intrinsically linked. And so what we're trying to do is build contracts that actually link the two of them explicitly. The third element that underlies all this stuff is using data to inform decision-making, by which I mean actually doing the tasting of the soup and the adding of the salt. So all of these things, as I'll talk through in the example, actually rely on constant access to administrative data and active performance management. So actually, once we bring all these parties to the table and write a contract, every 2 weeks we bring everyone back, or at least some component of everyone back, look at how we're tracking toward outcomes and troubleshoot. And then the last one is reliance on really strong shared governance. And this is something that you probably all feel a lot when we're building these cross-sector collaborations, but formal governance systems that share data and share financial accountability. And those things make it really real for everyone. So would it be helpful if I ran through an example, or should I?
Yeah, please.
I'll run through one example in California. We're working with, I mentioned Ventura County before, the Ventura County Executive Office and their probation agency. As in many counties, recidivism is a significant challenge in Ventura. And in the wake of the realignment, a whole handful of high-risk folks coming out of the county jail don't get a significant amount of services that AB 109 eligible probationers do. So similar risk levels, but some are getting significant behavioral health services and some aren't. In Ventura, we raised about $3 million to help scale up a suite of behavioral health services for non-AB 109 eligible high-risk probationers. So it's really focused on intensive case management and then a form of cognitive behavioral therapy called moral recognition therapy, along with a handful of supplemental services for this group of about 400 individuals. And then to the extent that their recidivism is reduced, in this case versus a randomized control group, so pretty rigorous evaluation, the county with some state matching funds will agree to repay those initial $2.65 million. So that kind of classic triangle, but focused in this case on recidivism reduction. We've done this kind of a model now in lots of different jurisdictions, including not just criminal justice, but also health and social services around reducing preterm births and emergency department visits, in the child welfare system around reducing re-referrals back to the system and out-of-home placements, in the workforce development space around getting better earnings for refugees and recent immigrants, and most recently for working with veterans with PTSD to help get them access to competitive employment. Can we do questions? Is that cool?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it.
You're saying that if you don't get the outcomes that you want, you either don't get paid or you pay back money back.
Sorry, can you say that last piece of that?
Tying payment to performance,
Yeah.
you don't get paid until you get the outcomes?
Right.
Or you get paid when you get paid?
It depends who the who is. So the people who are giving the upfront money, they don't get paid until and unless the outcomes are achieved. The nonprofits get paid immediately, and they get paid upfront and in full.
And then if they don't get good outcomes?
They typically don't take on performance risk, so they don't see an increase or decline based on that. A couple of them in these deals have taken on some small measure of performance risk, but most nonprofits we work with don't have the financial capacity to take on significant risk like that. But the investors do, that's what they do.
Ricardo, anything more you want to say?
Yeah.
Or do you want to give an example?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. So we had a healthcare clinic in San Diego call us and say, hey, we have a program called PACE, which I think you guys are familiar with, the PACE program. And our challenge is that when our clients lose their housing, they lose the PACE program. And we want to get into affordable housing, or we need to figure out a way to get housing for these folks. And our first response is, you don't want to get into affordable housing. It's very complicated and it's very scary. Just like I don't want to get into being a doctor or a nurse. But through that process, what we've told them is, look, you have assets. Maybe you own property, et cetera. You can use all of those assets to partner with a affordable housing developer to build a building, and they will build the building. They'll go out and find the funding, and they'll even create a space at the bottom for your clinic if that's what you're interested in. Because for affordable housing developers, if you've looked at affordable housing projects that have retail, the retail's not always that great. because affordable housing folks don't really understand retail and commercial space. And so in this particular instance, this would provide the clinic a place to go, but it also provides the affordable housing developer complete financial picture. So when they're out there getting money, they're able to tell a bank or other organization, no, I have rent coming for this space. It's coming from this organization, and this organization is going to pay. So don't worry about that. This makes it whole. So again, I think that's an example of where our two worlds are sort of colliding. And in this particular case, it was colliding because they're in a crisis. They don't know what to do. So they're just reaching out saying, how can we get into housing? And again, I think you don't want to get into an industry you're not familiar with, especially an industry as complicated as affordable housing. But you want to leverage the resources that you have. And that's the key thing in all this, because every organization, every healthcare organization has resources. Clinics and others, they have resources, they have land. Potentially sometimes they have land available. The other thing too is oftentimes clinic and other groups, they have a lot of folks that want to donate to them and provide them capital, provide them money, right? And so they use that money and they work with it. But if you're think about it a little bit more, you could go to that particular donor and say, well, you know what, this is wonderful you're giving us this money. This is great. Could you buy us this piece of land? Can you help us secure this piece of land instead? Because right when they've secured a piece of land, then you can actually build housing. And again, the affordable housing community understands that. So that's a little bit of an example of how the two worlds cross, but how in some ways they're crossing, but both cultures don't quite know or understand the challenges that each other is facing, right? We just know that in California especially, we have a housing crisis. We have a homeless crisis. And the answer is a home. And you folks see it on the other end when they go into some sort of healthcare center or something. Then you're seeing that, oh, they have a crisis. The challenge that you folks face is when they leave that facility, they're probably going right back out on the street. And so if they go right back out on the street, they're going to come right back to you guys again. And the cost is going to continue to increase and continue to increase. And so what's the answer? You've got to partner with other organizations that know this world. And fortunately, in California, we have a good group of people that have been building affordable housing for years. We have an infrastructure. Clearly, it's not as robust. And that's the challenge that the affordable housing community faces at their end of it, is the lack of capital. We do not have enough money to house people. Because if we did, they would be housed. States, things like low-income housing tax credits are not enough. And so we're always going to have this mismatch in terms of providing services. So if we're looking to the government to say, help, it's probably not going to happen very soon, because it's not happening now. But if we look to others in our community, others who have an interest in this space, we can probably aggregate our resources and we can actually probably tackle some of these very thorny issues. And that, I think, is what's exciting, and I think that's what's exciting what you're working on, because essentially he's bringing in investors who may have never cared about recidivism. They never cared. They're just interested in maybe making a buck and maybe doing some good. But now all of a sudden you fulfill it, they get their return back, and now the person's saying, well, what else can I do with this money? Right? Because that's the challenge, and it's really interesting up here in this community, because we have 3 offices, the Bay Area or the Northern California, Los Angeles, and San Diego. What's interesting about all 3 offices is it's a microcosm of your community. So up here, there's a lot of resources. There are foundations, there are individuals with incredible wealth up here. The challenge is, in our field, is can we build it? That's the problem we face up here, especially. I think it was San Jose recently, some community up here said no to student housing for teachers. That their teachers can't afford to live in the community, so the school district said, well, we're going to put housing on our property, and the community said, no, we don't want that housing, even for our kids' teachers. That's the big challenge that you face up here. It's not the lack of capital. And the other part of it, too, is even when we're building, affordable housing developers, if you say no to their project and your community rebels against them, most likely they're not going to go back to your community because it's difficult enough. And so the minute your community says no, that's off the map. The next community says no, that's off the map. Where are people going to go? And so it's important that have resources and groups like yours being able to say, no, this is important. We have to provide housing. Because if it's just the affordable housing community saying, no, we've got to build this housing, we've got to build this housing, we've got to build this housing, people say, well, of course you want to build the housing. You're probably trying to make money, right? But if we have other partners, people in the healthcare industry, and that's the other part too, is in the healthcare industry, you guys are very well trusted, right? Teachers, doctors, nurses, pretty trusted group of people. And so for you to speak on issues and say to communities or other groups, hey, this is an appropriate use, or for hospitals to actually look at the territory that they own, the pieces of land that they own, and to be able to say, no, we're going to provide housing, and this is a good thing to do, folks. That's important. That's really important, because right now, essentially, all you have is elected officials, homeless advocates, and affordable housing people basically going to neighborhoods and saying, this is unsustainable. But could you imagine if the healthcare industry joined us and said, this is unsustainable, California, you need to do something about this? The conversation changes. Yes.
The gentleman on the left, I'm sorry, the pithy, controversial one. What's your name? Jake. Have people, like, one of the big problems we have and an outcome we'd like in Orange County is, to reduce the homeless situation. And what have discussions been like, or have people come to you with that?
Yeah, we're building 3 deals in the homelessness space right now. So one in Anchorage, one in Austin, and one in a statewide in Rhode Island. Homelessness is almost a quintessential opportunity in that it is incredibly challenging, right? I mean, in terms of complexity, it is an order of magnitude more complex than almost any other thing that we're working on, and we're working on some pretty messy stuff. One of the kind of fundamental challenge around homelessness for me is diffusion, right? So the costs of homelessness are relatively diffuse across, health, behavioral health, criminal justice, housing, not to mention, I would say, broadly speaking, public safety. So when we try to, part of the reason why we have found it so hard to do work in this space is the activation energy is really high to get anything done in homelessness, right? It's quite expensive for to help serve the most vulnerable in this population, right? We're talking about not just housing, but also long-term support. And no individual actor is necessarily incentivized to take on all of that effort. So our homelessness projects to date have largely focused on the chronically homeless, in part because they are relatively high cost for the jurisdictions we're working with, which are in California would be mostly at the county level. In Anchorage, it's a combination between the municipality of Anchorage and the state. And then in Austin, it's a combination between the city, the county, and the healthcare system there. So we're focused on permanent supportive housing with intensive case management or assertive community treatment. And then we are bringing in multiple different outcomes payers, each to pay on the outcomes they care most about. So this might be, for example, a city paying on housing stability, a state or a county paying on reductions in criminal justice utilization, so days back in jail or prison, and then managed care organization paying on the basis of a reduction in ED visits and or hospitalizations. Those are the Austin and Anchorage projects we're building now. Did I actually answer your question or just run around it?
There's another one over.
Use my teacher voice. I just wanted to ask, so you mentioned that there are some evaluations that you do of the nonprofits and try to identify those actors that have effective interventions. Can you talk a little bit about how you do that?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. There's essentially 2 different pieces that we're trying to diligence. One is the evidence and one is the actual organization. When we think about evidence, it's essentially 3 big chunks, right? So it's the strength of retrospective evaluations, which I'll talk a little bit more in a second, the relevance of those evaluations, and the effects of them, right? So when we're thinking about strength, we're talking about the classic questions of evaluation design and then the relevancy of that design to the problem. So how was the comparison group or control group constructed? Was that the right way of doing it? And are there any significant biases built into those studies? A quick aside. We find that the way that people define evidence-based policies or evidence-based interventions is often absurd. I think that's the technical term for it. Yeah, absurd, but said in a funny voice. Absurd, like that. The idea of cherry-picking a single piece of evidence in order to qualify something as evidence-based or not is not the way to read social science literature. We should all get on the same page about this quickly, right? If you have a single study that demonstrates a significant impact and 42 other studies that demonstrate no or negative impacts, you're probably not making impact. Let's all be clear on that. Okay, that's my aside on the piece that's around strength of evidence. Relevance is exactly what it sounds like, but we often underrate that when we as, public sector often underrate the impact of relevance. So we're talking about geographic relevance, is this urban versus rural? Time relevance, right? Is a study done in 1962, any of you preschool people out there? Was it done among a similar demographic, a similar target population? Other aspects of relevance, similar kinds of delivery mechanism, et cetera. And then effect, and again, we should get on the same page about this. Big effects matter more than small effects. No surprise, but also in the kind of evidence-based policy movement, anything that clears that initial bar, most people kind of think, oh, this is good. Big effects matter more. So, I'm much more willing to forgive something that has lower quality of evidence if it has big effects, and vice versa. So that's the way we think about, retrospective evidence. In terms of organizational diligence, these are the things exactly what you think they are. Strength of leadership in the board, program model fidelity, data systems, community support, things like that.
Other questions?
Hi. Permanent supportive housing, absolutely agree with that model and more of it. Once housed, individuals have a fear of losing benefits or housing if they access some of the linkages to employment services or begin to access an income. What are we talking about that? I mean, that's preventing people from leaving permanent supportive housing and trying to access market rate housing, and that's also perpetuating this lack of affordable housing. So are we looking at how do we, we already have something in place, what are we doing to create those links intentionally to services that are already available, and who are the people that can most effectively create those links?
I hope someone in this room is thinking about that.
I am.
Good. No, I mean, most of my work is about expanding access and getting people into PSH who otherwise wouldn't be able to. And I think moving on programs make a ton of sense, and it's important to think about that.
Yeah. On our side of it, a lot of our partners, our affordable housing developers, do a lot of that work. I mean, many they don't own necessarily, they own the property, but they don't really own the building. They can't go to a bank and say, hey, give me money for all these units. And so oftentimes they will stay on to manage the building and put in the service, and they'll make sure there's services in the building. So a lot of that's kind of taken care of by the end product from our developer partners that end up doing that.
On the social impact bond, I'm just curious as to how this actually works, because a lot of times the benefits that you would get in a cost-benefit study on a lot of these public interventions are a long stream, they're kind of dispersed, they don't show up in the state's revenue balance stream next year, and so are people's budgets getting cut to pay back these investors, or is there a fear of that? Or the logistics of it seem challenging to me, because in government we don't tend to cut once we've shown a successful program. We say we're going to reinvest or better serve or do a better job with the resources, because we always feel like we don't have enough. And so now it seems like you'd have to pay back your investors plus fund the ongoing service that you've now determined is a great service. And so I guess I'm just curious as to how this actually works in practice.
I think there are about 4 questions embedded in that question. Let me see if I can cover at least some of them. The first is I want to expand on the problem that you put your finger on, which is what we broadly call the wrong pockets problem. Probably a lot of other people do too. There are 2 forms of wrong pockets problem, a horizontal one and a vertical one. The horizontal wrong pockets problem is one agency spends money, another agency accrues the value from that. The vertical wrong pockets problem is the same thing, but at a jurisdiction level. So state spends money, but the feds reap the benefit, or vice versa. So that's kind of one existential challenge that we're facing. Another one is what I would call a time value problem, which is you spend money today and you reap benefits sometime in the future. Which I think is also a critical, and I want to put that to the side for a second too, for the third problem, which is what I would call a fiscal versus social problem, right? Which is what many people in this room probably think of as cost savings versus other stuff we care about. All 3 of those are fundamental challenges in a good cost-benefit analysis, and if you're not treating them all carefully, you're likely to get a wacky answer. So let's stick with it for a minute. When I think about the latter 2, we typically think about it in, I'm a former management consultant, forgive me, in a 2x2, right? So there's near-term and long-term, and then there's fiscal and social. Near term is typically within whatever we can measure within a deal. So it's typically 4 to 7 years. And we treat that differently than we treat long-term value. In theory, we would like to incorporate as much potential value being created through an intervention as possible in doing the cost-benefit analysis. But things in the future are less likely, and also we might care about them less. If we're getting really nerdy for a second, future impact might actually be worth less than current impact. Everyone on the same page with me? All right, at least a couple people. Good. So when we're building out a cost-benefit analysis, we're trying to discount the future in 2 ways. And ultimately, we have to work with our public sector stakeholders to feel comfortable on how we're doing those discounts. Different states or different jurisdictions are going to feel differently about the future. So they actually might discount it at a higher or a lower rate. And ultimately, that's an analytical choice that they'll have to guide us on. Fiscal versus social is where it gets really messy, though. Really exciting. Fiscal are things like, if you think about our second deal with the state of South Carolina around reducing, let's just talk about preterm birth for a minute. The fiscal aspect of that is reductions in NICU costs, for example. If you have fewer preterm births, fewer babies are going to spend time in the intensive care unit. And that saves money. But there's another side of this too, which is fewer preterm births also means fewer babies dying, right? Which we can probably all get on the same page as something we care about. And we're actually willing to spend money on it. Ultimately, the way that policymakers have budgeted things to date, we actually are factoring in both sides of that equation in the way that we budget things. Right? We actually spend a lot of money on infant mortality reduction, even as an explicit goal, let alone implicitly baked into other things. So what we're actually asking policymakers to do is put explicit valuations on some of these outcomes that otherwise were baked implicitly into budgeting today. So doing that is hard, right? We have some stakes in the ground on how you can value different kinds of social outcomes, including things like infant mortality, but it's never going to be perfect. It's as much art as science. But doing the modeling, I think, actually makes explicit what previously has been implicit. Going back to your first question, which is maybe the hardest of all of them, which is how do you solve wrong pockets problems? There's no easy way to do it. We do it tactically from a couple of different perspectives. Tactic one is we tend to work with central offices, so we work with OMB or finance within a given jurisdiction to help cut across different agencies and say, if we're going to be spending money out of this budget and it's going to be impacting this budget, how do we make sure that critical services aren't being cut? We also tactically are writing contracts, right? So if one agency ultimately needs to be subsidizing another, there are tools that we can put in place that are essentially transfers between those agencies. That's a kind of a silly thing to do within a jurisdiction, right? Because this is all the same pot of money and it's all coming from the taxpayers for the most part. But we can do that, as needed. I feel like I could expand upon this further, but maybe I shouldn't. Maybe we should talk afterward. Did that answer your question?
Sort of. Do you get pushback from labor and other groups? This seems like something that would be highly controversial.
Highly what?
Controversial to implement, because folks would be terrified about the paying back part and the seeing it as, contracting out and defunding public services, even though I understand that's not the model, but what if there's a recession as the bill comes due, it showed a good outcome, but your revenues overall have dropped, and so now you have to pay this back.
Yeah, let me speak to a couple of those things. Many of the services we're talking about today are already outsourced, right? I would say the majority of social services that we're talking about are actually outsourced today to nonprofits, right? So that's not new, and it's not necessarily a problem. From a security standpoint, like a financial security standpoint, as we're delivering services, governments are typically putting money away to pay for outcomes if they're achieved in the future. So that actually helps to ensure against a major change in the macroeconomic landscape. And then your question around labor. For the most part, the deals we've done, labor hasn't really been a part of it. I could imagine one in which labor would have a vested stake. But for the most part, we're actually not talking about cutting jobs, right? We're essentially trying to demonstrate that a new service or a scaled up service actually has incremental benefit to a jurisdiction. So that's, if anything, that might be a carrot or something that labor would be excited about. I can imagine a world in which labor would not be excited in a given instance, right? So for example, in our criminal justice work, if ultimately we do significantly reduce recidivism, knocking on wood here, That may ultimately be a threat to future jobs, but this is one of 62 recidivism reduction plays in the state of California right now, so I don't think we're top of their list.
Any other
Could we take just a minute to talk about federal legislation, because you asked how people can get involved.
Oh, go on.
Do you want to talk opportunity zones for a minute?
So there was in the recent tax bill of the federal government, there was a thing put in there called opportunity zones. And opportunity zones are basically a tax write-off process for individuals who have to realize capital gains. And so if you have capital gains you need to realize, you can put your money in what's called an opportunity zone, and you can get, if you leave it in there for about up to 10 years or so, you can get a good chunk of that, the tax forgiven. The interesting thing about opportunity zones is it's actually, you have to be an equity investor. So if I'm selling a bunch of Facebook stock and I don't want to pay all the taxes, and I put it into an opportunity zone, and I put that opportunity zone into a business in Oakland, I have to actually I'm an equity investor in this business in Oakland. So if the business in Oakland after 10 years realizes some gains, I get those gains too. And those gains, I don't believe that they'll be taxed, those gains. And so what's interesting about this is, if you think about inner city communities, the way we've been putting money into communities is either low-income housing tax credits to build affordable housing, new market tax credits, which essentially builds commercial space or helps run a business, and then I guess what banks do with CRA, because that's pretty significant. Opportunity zones will be a whole new avenue that we don't even know how many people will be interested in, because to the investor, this is a tax write-off method. To the end user, this is putting money into communities that are already, that the state's already identified as opportunity zones, which pretty much mirror a lot of our inner city communities of opportunities, we like to say. It mirrors most of those communities. And so that's really very fascinating to us. The challenging part of this is going to be that it's very easy to self-certify to do a fund. Anybody can self-certify. And so you could foresee a situation where there's a lot of money going into communities and the community has no idea what's going on, but things are changing quick. And so that's why for us, at a group like LISP, we want to make sure that there's an intentionality about where that funding is invested. And again, you could see that from this industry as well, that there could be plays in communities that may have some sort of health benefit that investors may be interested in participating in. And again, their interest is really more for themselves. But long-term, what's fascinating about this is you could have an investor, let's say here, I'm up here and I invest in a small community in San Diego, and next thing you know, the outcomes are good, I realize a return, but actually now I'm really interested where my investment went into that community, and now those communities could potentially have additional resources come to them in the way of individuals who never knew anything about them, but because of this tax policy issue, they were able to make those investments. And so that's a very big thing and again, we don't know, it could be trillions of dollars. We have no idea how big this market will be.
Last comment?
Yeah, last thing for me. Amazingly, there were a couple of nice nuggets stuck in the tax bill.
Yeah.
Right? Opportunity zones is one of them. Another one is something in my little field called the SIPRA, which is the Social Impact Partnerships Pay for Results Act. Got it. Yeah, that's a great acronym. We're just going to call it the Results Act. It's a $100 million pot of money stuck into the U.S. Treasury that is meant to match local and state jurisdictions on outcomes payments. So if you think about that triangle, the bottom right piece in which jurisdictions put up money for outcomes payments, the feds have typically taken a free ride to date. So for on things that actually benefit federal government, they haven't really paid in their part of the vertical wrong pockets problem. This is their way of doing that. So they put $100 million aside that they will release an RFP for state and local jurisdictions to apply for starting in late January, early February to match outcomes payments. So we're hoping to see this field tick up a little bit in the next year.